The billionaire mother had seen her daughter afraid of doctors, strangers, storms, and even crowded rooms, but she had never seen her run toward a man she had known for less than a week. That morning, as 12-year-old Elsie Hartwell suddenly broke away from her mother and sprinted across the marble driveway toward the family's new driver, Vivienne Hartwell froze in absolute disbelief. The man had only been hired 3 days earlier, yet Elsie threw both arms around his waist as though she had been searching for him her entire life. Vivienne's heart nearly stopped when her daughter looked up with trembling eyes and whispered something that made every breath leave her mother's body at once: "He saved me." If you believe kindness can heal wounds money cannot touch, forgiveness can change a life, hope can find people in their darkest moments, and everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a meaningful comment, and subscribe to our channel so our community can keep sharing stories that remind us what truly matters. Vivienne Hartwell owned buildings that touched the clouds, companies that employed thousands, and a private estate surrounded by iron gates and manicured gardens. Business magazines called her brilliant, ruthless, and unstoppable. People assumed a woman who could purchase almost anything had learned how to solve every problem. But there was one thing money had never been able to buy her: the return of the carefree child her daughter had once been. Elsie had changed after a terrible accident 18 months earlier. She had survived, physically, but something inside her had become frightened and withdrawn. She stopped riding horses, stopped swimming, stopped attending parties, and eventually stopped trusting unfamiliar adults. She barely spoke outside the home. Vivienne responded the only way she knew how: by building walls around her daughter. Private tutors replaced school. Security guards followed them everywhere. Doctors, therapists, specialists, and consultants came and went. Every possible danger was removed from Elsie's world, yet the more protected she became, the smaller her world seemed. Then came Callum Reed. He was 38, quiet, broad-shouldered, and remarkably observant. His resume was strangely modest for a man who carried himself with such discipline. He had worked as a commercial driver, security contractor, and emergency transport specialist. There were gaps in his employment history that Vivienne found suspicious, but the agency had assured her that Callum was reliable, sober, professional, and exceptionally skilled behind the wheel. She hired him because her previous driver had resigned after Elsie refused to get into the car with him. Callum never pressured the girl. He simply opened the door when she approached, waited when she hesitated, and never asked why she was afraid. On his first morning, he noticed that Elsie always sat on the passenger side of the rear seat and kept one hand wrapped around the door handle. He adjusted the seatbelt so it would not press against an old scar on her shoulder. He never mentioned noticing it. Over the next 3 days, something remarkable began to happen. Elsie started looking forward to the drive to her tutor's house. She still barely spoke, but she began leaving little folded pieces of paper on the seat. Sometimes they contained drawings. Sometimes they were simply small observations about birds, trees, or clouds. Callum never treated them as childish scribbles. He studied each one with genuine attention and returned them carefully to the same place. Vivienne noticed the change but could not understand it. She had spent a fortune trying to make her daughter feel safe, while this ordinary-looking driver seemed capable of doing something none of the experts had managed to do. That morning, however, Vivienne's suspicion returned. She had been standing beside the front entrance reviewing a business report when she noticed Elsie staring through the glass doors toward the driveway. Callum had just parked the family SUV. Before he could reach the entrance, Elsie suddenly ran outside. Vivienne called after her, terrified that her daughter might trip, but Elsie did not stop. She crossed the driveway and rushed straight into Callum's arms. The driver instinctively caught her, then looked over her shoulder at Vivienne with an expression of concern rather than triumph. Elsie buried her face against his jacket. When Vivienne reached them, her daughter finally pulled back and looked at her mother with tears filling her eyes. Her voice was barely audible, but the words were unmistakable. Callum had saved her. Vivienne demanded to know what Elsie meant. Her daughter could not explain everything. She was shaking too badly. Callum remained silent until Vivienne asked him directly. He told her that 2 mornings earlier, while driving Elsie home from her tutor, he had noticed a dark sedan following them. At first he assumed it was coincidence. Then he changed lanes twice, slowed down, and watched the sedan mirror every movement. Callum had quietly taken a different route and stopped near a busy public building instead of driving straight home. He had not wanted to frighten Elsie, so he simply told her they were taking a small detour. The sedan eventually disappeared. Vivienne immediately called her security chief, who initially dismissed the concern. But Callum insisted that the vehicle had appeared again later that afternoon. This time, he had written down its license plate. The security team checked the footage from the estate and discovered that the same vehicle had passed the property several times over the previous week. Someone had been watching the family. Vivienne's fear quickly became anger. She demanded to know why Callum had not reported everything immediately. His answer unsettled her. He explained that he had not wanted to alarm Elsie before he knew whether the threat was real. He had spent years learning that panic could turn a dangerous situation into a disaster. He had protected her first and investigated quietly afterward. Vivienne wanted to believe him, but something about his calmness troubled her. It was not the calmness of an experienced driver. It was the calmness of someone who had spent years surrounded by danger. She ordered a background investigation. What came back left her speechless. Callum Reed had not always been a civilian driver. Years earlier, he had served as a Navy SEAL. His military record showed commendations for courage and emergency response, but it also contained a devastating chapter. During a rescue operation overseas, Callum had been responsible for getting several people to safety after an explosion destroyed their extraction route. He succeeded, but one of his closest teammates did not survive. Callum had carried the man's personal effects home and blamed himself for years, even though the official investigation concluded that there had been nothing he could have done differently. After leaving the military, Callum struggled with guilt and refused several high-profile security positions. He wanted an ordinary life. He wanted to be a father to his young daughter, Clara, and he wanted to believe he could protect someone without constantly expecting tragedy. But fate had taken Clara from him too. A sudden illness had claimed her life at only 7 years old. That was the reason Callum understood Elsie. He knew what it felt like to wake up and realize the person you would have protected with your entire life was gone. He knew what fear did to children. He knew what silence looked like when grief was too heavy for words. And he knew that sometimes the best way to save someone was not to tell them they were safe, but to stay beside them until they believed it themselves. Vivienne found herself unexpectedly ashamed. She had assumed Callum was simply a driver. She had measured him by his uniform and salary while ignoring the quiet dignity in the way he treated her daughter. She also realized something painful about herself. She had spent 18 months protecting Elsie from the world because she could not bear the possibility of losing her. But in doing so, she had unknowingly taught Elsie that the world was something to fear. That afternoon, Vivienne watched from the terrace as Elsie sat beneath an old maple tree while Callum repaired a loose wheel on her bicycle. Elsie had not ridden it since the accident. Callum did not ask her to ride. He simply fixed it and left it beside her. After several minutes, Elsie touched the handlebars. Then she looked toward her mother. Vivienne did something she had never done before. She nodded. Elsie slowly climbed onto the bicycle. Her first attempt lasted only a few feet before she stopped. Her face filled with fear. Vivienne almost ran toward her, but Callum gently raised a hand, signaling her to wait. Elsie took a breath and tried again. This time she went farther. Then farther still. By the third attempt, she was riding across the garden. Vivienne began crying. Not because her daughter had learned to ride again, but because she finally understood that love was not always about standing between someone and danger. Sometimes love meant standing close enough to catch them if they fell while still allowing them to discover that they could move forward on their own. But the danger Callum had noticed was real. The security team traced the suspicious vehicle to a former financial advisor named Graham Voss, who had once worked for one of Vivienne's companies. He had been dismissed after manipulating internal accounts and had recently been trying to pressure Vivienne into paying him to keep damaging information private. The investigation uncovered evidence that he had been monitoring the estate and attempting to frighten the family into making a settlement. Vivienne's first instinct was to fight him with lawyers, money, and influence. Callum encouraged her to let the authorities handle the matter properly. For once, Vivienne listened. She stopped trying to control every outcome herself. The investigation eventually cleared the family of immediate danger, and Graham was arrested for stalking, harassment, and financial crimes connected to his scheme. But the greatest change happened inside the Hartwell home. Vivienne began eating lunch with Elsie instead of working through it. She reduced the layers of security surrounding her daughter. She allowed Elsie to return gradually to school. She stopped treating every difficult emotion as a crisis that needed to be eliminated. And she started asking her daughter what she wanted rather than deciding what was best for her. Callum remained the family driver, but he became much more than that. He became the quiet presence who understood when Elsie needed encouragement and when she needed space. He never tried to replace the father Elsie had lost years earlier. He simply became someone she trusted. One warm afternoon several months later, Vivienne stood in the garden watching Elsie ride her bicycle without training wheels. Callum was nearby, holding nothing but a small helmet in his hands. Elsie raced across the grass, laughing so loudly that Vivienne almost didn't recognize the sound. She had forgotten how her daughter's laughter used to fill a room. When Elsie finally stopped, she ran toward her mother. Vivienne knelt and embraced her. Then Elsie turned toward Callum and ran into his arms too. Vivienne watched them and realized that the man she had once considered nothing more than an employee had given her something far more valuable than protection. He had reminded her how to trust. He had shown her that strength could be gentle. He had taught her that grief did not have to become a prison and that people who had been broken by life could still become safe places for others. Later, Vivienne found Callum standing near the garden gate. She thanked him, but he shook his head. He told her that he had not saved Elsie alone. He had simply helped her remember that she could save herself. Those words stayed with Vivienne. She offered Callum a senior security position with her company, but he declined. He wanted to keep driving because he liked the ordinary moments. He liked opening doors, carrying groceries, fixing small things, and watching people slowly become happier. Vivienne respected his choice. Instead, she helped establish a foundation in memory of Callum's daughter, Clara, dedicated to supporting children recovering from traumatic experiences and families who could not afford specialized care. Callum initially resisted, but eventually accepted, not because he wanted his name attached to anything, but because Clara's memory could now help other children find their way back to life. Years later, Elsie would still remember that morning when she ran across the driveway. She would remember the fear in her mother's face, the strength in Callum's arms, and the words she whispered when she finally found someone who made her feel safe. He saved me. But the truth was even more beautiful. Callum had saved Elsie from danger, but Elsie had saved Callum from believing his life had ended with his grief. Vivienne had saved herself from becoming a mother who confused control with love. And together, they discovered that sometimes broken people do not need to be fixed. They need to be understood, forgiven, and given the courage to begin again. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, tell us in the comments what this story means to you. Do you believe that sometimes the people who enter our lives unexpectedly can help us heal wounds we thought would never close? Because sometimes a second chance does not arrive wearing a crown, carrying millions, or making grand promises. Sometimes it arrives quietly, opens a car door, notices that a frightened child needs someone to stay, and simply refuses to walk away. And that afternoon, beneath the warm daylight and the old maple tree, Elsie rode her bicycle farther than she ever had before. Her mother watched with tears in her eyes. Callum stood nearby, smiling. And for the first time in a very long time, none of them were looking backward. They were simply watching a little girl move forward, carrying with her the courage of a mother who learned to let go, the strength of a man who had survived loss, and the beautiful truth that even the deepest wounds can become places where hope begins.